three members of the family of racing commentator John Hunt. Kyle Clifford killed his wife Carol and their daughters Louise and Hannah in Hertfordshire last July. Politicians in Ireland have failed to select a new Prime Minister following last month's general election. A vote will now take place tomorrow after today's sitting ended in a row over speaking time. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed down 3 points at 85.45. The pound buys $1.24 and €1.18. LBC weather, some showers on the coasts tonight, dry elsewhere and a low of 1 degree. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening and welcome to Wednesday's Cross Question. I'm Iain Dale, and let me tell you who's on our panel tonight to answer your questions. Sitting to my left, Lucy Frazer, former Conservative Culture Secretary. To her left, Luke Pollard, Labour Defence Minister. He's Minister for the Armed Forces and MP for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport, and he's also covers Ukraine in his portfolio as well. So a very good evening to be on the programme from our point of view, hopefully from yours as well, Luke. To my right, Baroness Claire Fox, non-affiliated peer, the Director of the Academy of Ideas think tank and author of the book I Find That Offensive. And to her right, Stephen Bush, Associate Editor of and columnist for the Financial Times. They're here to answer your calls on 0345 6060 973. You can WhatsApp us on that number or text 84850 and do watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Mike's just been listening to the interview with Joe Coburn says Cross Question is much better than Politics Live. I couldn't possibly judge because I go on that as well. Right, let's go to a text question from Siobhan in Coventry. Is Trump actually going to end the war in Ukraine as he promised? Luke Pollard.
Well, I hope we can get to peace this year because Ukraine are facing unbelievable horrors on the front line. We know that as the war stretches up to its third anniversary of this latest criminal invasion, which will happen next month, the casualties on the front line on both sides are utterly horrific. We're seeing continued aerial bombardment of Ukrainian cities, energy infrastructure in particular. The loss of life is horrible. So we want to see a resolution to that. Just
on that, I read today that 40% of the North Korean soldiers that have been sent to fight for Russia, they're now dead. 40% of them. Is that right? Do you know?
So we think roughly around 10 to 12,000 North Korean troops were deployed initially to the Kursk region. The casualties were previously projected around 2,000 to 3,000. We now think around a third of that figure have now been killed or severely injured. Now, I don't think Putin cares much about Russian lives. I certainly don't think he cares very much about North Korean lives. And he doesn't seem to show any care about the lives of his own soldiers as well. And I think the real difficulty we've got here is it's an attritional conflict. It is hard graft on the front line. People are being killed at a really significant rate. And what we're seeing is the Ukrainians getting more and more effective in the tactics they're doing and killing more and more Russians every day. But yet Russia still continues. So we do need to see a resolution to this. And the objective of the UK government and many of our NATO allies is to put Ukraine in the very best possible position on the battlefield, but also the very best possible position if negotiations do come. And that is making sure that they can preserve their freedom, their sovereignty, and their ability to be free from this horrendous illegal invasion.
Now, you will have seen the statement from President Trump on Twitter tonight. Do you think that Putin is going to take this seriously in any way, or what do you think? I mean, do you have any intelligence on what his response might be?
Well, we know that Putin responds to pressure, but we also know that there has been much talk about how this war should end. President Zelensky has presented his victory plan, which sets out how Ukraine can be free, which means a lot more resources going into a lot more weapon systems and security guarantees in the future. In the election campaign, President Trump spoke about ending the war within 24 hours. We're now having, I think, President Trump using his new platform to be able to signal very, very clearly to President Putin that he expects this war to end. The focus on economic sanctions is very Trump in terms of his usual style. But what we've seen is Ukraine needing military support as well. It's the reason that the UK is providing £3 billion a year of military aid. But the amount of shells and artillery and missiles that Ukraine goes through, if we want to keep them in the fight and not have Russia overrun their lines, especially in eastern Ukraine on the Pokrovsk axis in particular, they're going to need military support as well.
But do you think this intervention today from Donald Trump is helpful?
I mean, it's a significant intervention. It really is.
Yeah, that's not quite what I asked.
I think it is helpful because I think there's a lot of speculation about what would he do when he comes into office. Would Ukraine be an issue that he wouldn't care about, or would it be one that he will take a very strong position on? And we've seen within a few days of taking office again, a very strong Trump statement, ending this ridiculous war, as he calls it.
I'm told that Boris Johnson has been a key influencer on Donald Trump on Ukraine, and over the last few months has been almost sort of badgering him to take a different stance to that which we all thought he might take. Now, I've got no idea. I've been told that that's the case, but if that is the case, would you pay tribute to Boris Johnson for that intervention? Because he doesn't seem to be listening to many people on Ukraine at the moment.
Well, I haven't heard about Boris Johnson's involvement. I know that he's had a very strong opinion on this, and actually in opposition and now in government, it is so important that we have a cross-party position, a unified, united UK position, because the gaps between the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, or any of those political figures is where Putin will exploit. So I expect there to be condemnation of Putin's ongoing invasion, but the more that we can work to solidify the Western alliance, to make sure Ukraine's getting the equipment they need and the support, especially as we hopefully get to the point where there can be negotiations and we can see Ukraine being free from this conflict, we'll need to have cross-party support across both sides of the political spectrum, on this side of the Atlantic and the other.
Lucy.
Well, you asked the question, is he going to end the war? And I think what we've seen so far from Donald Trump is that the US voted for a strong and effective leader. That's what they wanted. And I think his actions to date, even before he became the president, show that he is and will be a strong and effective leader. You might not agree with his ideology or how he goes about things, but even before he took office, I think we must acknowledge the impact that he's had in the Middle East. And I think that what he said today is effective, worthwhile, and hopefully will be game-changing in Russia and Ukraine.
But what does a deal look like? Because the most likely thing I think that may well happen is that Putin will agree to some sort of deal if he keeps Donbass, if he keeps Crimea. Now, he could portray that as some sort of victory, but I'm not sure that would be acceptable for Ukraine. And surely in the end, it's the Ukrainians that have got to decide what is acceptable and what isn't, not us.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. It is for Ukraine to decide. I mean, President Zelensky, I think, is an incredible force, and he's stood firm throughout this. I think he's done a fantastic job to keep getting the support, quite rightly, of the UK and across Europe, because I think if this war doesn't come to an end, then there is a huge risk for Europe. And we have all relied on the US. And obviously, we've done our bit. Boris Johnson, you mentioned, was a significant supporter of Ukraine. But this is a worrying time for Europe. So, yes, President Zelensky should be deciding the terms on which the war comes to an end. And I think, obviously, the issue of whether or not they can join NATO must be something I'm sure that they're thinking very carefully about.
Claire Fox.
So, a little bit like what happened with the hostages, it's a sort of great celebration that the Middle East peace deal, the 3 hostages being released and so on, has happened, and undoubtedly Trump can take some credit for that. But it's also something that you could see was in the ether anyway. So I don't want to underestimate the importance of Trump, but I also think it's partly where we are at in that particular conflict. And I think it's true in relation to Ukraine and Russia, that it's been a long, vicious... I mean, Luke, you really explained it well. I think you really painted that picture that we're all familiar with very helpfully. I was relieved that, of course, that he was threatening Putin, because at one point you weren't sure whether he was going to come in and say if Zelensky doesn't come to the table.
Yeah.
So, let's.
But that's why I thought it was important to make the Boris Johnson point.
No, absolutely. And whoever is responsible, and full credit if it's Boris Johnson, whoever it is, I'm delighted that, of course, that's the emphasis that he's put on this. Just a couple of other things, because it's obviously not my area of expertise. There's no doubt about it that Zelensky will probably have to compromise something. But obviously it is important that it's not seen as a betrayal of the sovereignty that was so brutally overridden by that invasion. Everybody, when something comes to an end, wants to claim victory. I mean, Hamas, who I think have absolutely taken a hammering in the Middle East in relation to Israel, came out and said, we've won the war, right? So, people are going to do that anyway. But it is very important, I think, that points that have been made, that we've got a situation where genuinely we know that sovereignty was not completely trashed, and therefore Ukraine does need to have some substantial victory from this, or substantially not give away too much. And I understand that. Just the final thing is, there is something that's been nagging at me for a while, which is I increasingly meet people who do not support Ukraine in the war. It's grown and grown and grown. And now I've been a bit sort of hardline ultra on this, because I think that what Russia's invasion was, so egregious, and I won't repeat that. But I have noticed that, and I've felt that politicians, myself included, can't take for granted that the public support. So when you say there's all this money going to be spent on Ukraine, I saw the Labour Party got a lot of stick, and I'm happy to give the Labour Party stick on a lot of things, but the Ukraine one was one I didn't. But what I think politicians have got to recognise is that whilst this war goes on, we've got to win hearts and minds. That's been very much an issue in America, but it's increasingly an issue here. I just noticed it amongst people I think that
has been the case since the beginning. I mean, certainly judging by the callers that call into this show, right from the start, you'd have a lot of Russian apologists.
I agree. No, but there's Russian apologists. No, that crowd I get. I'm talking about a growing sense of war weariness, of people feeling it's, is it worth it? It's costing us a lot of money. I've just noticed. So what I'm saying is,
Luke?
You've got to win the arguments in the hearts and minds.
I would agree with that argument. We've got to keep making the case as to why Ukraine's security is our security, because Russian aggression is not going to stop in Ukraine if they win in Ukraine. They're going to continue pressuring. And as we've seen in the House of Commons today, making a statement, the Defence Secretary spoke about the Russian spy ship loitering over some of our critical national infrastructure, the undersea cables, doing something there.
We're going to come on to that in just a second, so hold your horses on that.
But there is definitely a risk, and what we've got to make clear, I think, is that what happens in Ukraine does matter here.
Yeah.
It's not some far-off land that doesn't affect us.
And on principle, by the way, around national sovereignty and borders and so on.
Well, the thing we didn't know with the return of Donald Trump is, would we get the Donald Trump who, and I'm afraid I slightly disagree with Claire about what happened in the Middle East. I think actually without Donald Trump's personal intervention, Netanyahu would not have agreed a peace deal, would not have been willing to risk his coalition. Now, in the Middle East, Donald Trump was actually quite a good president for peace last time around. He was influential in the Abraham Accords. In Afghanistan, Donald Trump was a pretty disastrous president. He signed that deal which led to the Afghan withdrawal, which obviously happened under Joe Biden and was such a disaster for the people of Afghanistan. And we didn't know which Donald Trump we would get in Europe. Would we get the sign a deal that is bad for Ukraine, bad for Europe, or would we get the Donald Trump that we saw in the Middle East? It looks from that tweet that hopefully we're getting the Donald Trump that we saw in the Middle East last time. But I think absolutely what used to be the case about this country is we were rare in that we didn't have a sizable pro-Russian force in the electorate, and we still don't really have one represented in the House of Commons. But people are starting to go, look, we all became a lot poorer because of Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. People are worried that the war can't be won, and Luke's exactly right. The argument does have to be made that ultimately Ukraine is not just fighting and dying for Ukraine's sovereignty, but for ours, and the principle that large countries should not be able to redraw the map of Europe or anywhere by force. Claire is exactly right, and the point of the sovereignty and freedom of all of us is at stake in this conflict. But politicians do need, and not just politicians, all of us in public life who know that, have to take some responsibility for making the argument for it.
Well, let's just take a follow-up text question from Darren in Bexhill, who says, if Putin is sending spy ships to our coastline, surely it's time to boost spending on our armed forces now. Well, the Defence Secretary, John Healey, says the Royal Navy has been monitoring a Russian ship called Yantar, which carries surveillance equipment and can launch drones down to the seabed when it was sailing around British waters earlier this week. This evening, the chair of the Defence Select Committee, Labour MP Tan Deshi, has told LBC that the government needs to set out exactly when it plans to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP. I'll add a rider to that because I think any government is going to have to increase defence spending to nearer 4 or 5% of GDP in the next few years. Why won't, Luke Pollard, why won't you put a timetable on this?
I mean, we have put a timetable on the announcement. We will be announcing a path to 2.5% of GDP in the spring. At the same time, in the spring, we'll also be publishing the Strategic Defence Review.
I thought that had been delayed to the autumn.
No, we're still intending to publish the Strategic Defence Review. And the key bit about this is we need to fundamentally adapt our armed forces, because the lessons of what we're seeing in Ukraine is challenging the way we structure our forces. On a very basic level, if you take how our army works, previously they worked on the deep and the close. And the words are important. The close were close up front, where you could have a tank firing at an enemy position. That was the close. And further beyond that, it was the deep, where you fired a rocket at. What we now know in Ukraine is instead of the close being a matter of tens of kilometres, the close is now 800, 900 kilometres. It's fundamentally changed how we fight our war, and we need to restructure our forces. So it's not just a matter of what money you're spending. And, you know, in the budget, we increased defence spending by £3 billion next year, which is an important step in the right direction. But we need to make sure we're spending it on the right kit and capabilities. And one of those is precisely in relation to the Yantar. We need more capabilities that protects our undersea cables, because they're vital not just for energy transmission, both gas and electricity, vital for telecoms. Our entire economy relies on the internet, and the internet doesn't flow through satellites primarily. It flows through undersea cables. And we know that if Russia loiters over our cable infrastructure, there's a risk to it. And that is why we've been very clear today, the Defence Secretary in the House of Commons saying, we see you, Russia. We know what you're doing, and by calling it out, and that's the reason why we've published for the declassified, which is unusual, that we surfaced a Royal Navy nuclear submarine alongside the Yantar, at which point the Yantar left the area of concern, publishing it very clearly to say, we see what you're doing, Russia, and this should be acting as a deterrence from that happening in the future. But we're going to have to invest in different capabilities in the future to keep our country safe and to keep our allies safe. That means not just what we spend, but what we spend it on as well matters.
Just on the Strategic Defence Review, I was sure I wasn't imagining that it might be delayed till October. The Telegraph were reporting 3 days ago that it says Labour's Defence Review could be delayed until the autumn, despite pressure on the government to increase military spending according to industry figures. So can you guarantee us that it will be this spring?
I mean, the Defence Secretary has been clear today. We expect to publish the Defence Review in the spring. Equally, we expect to set out a path to 2.5% as well. But
are you beginning to feel that 2.5% might not be enough, given what's going on, particularly with Russia, given this kind of incident? We've seen Chinese boats, I think, in the Baltic doing damaging the undersea cables, which if some of those are cut, I mean, that's a very bleak future indeed.
I mean, we have deployed forces, RAF P-8 Poseidon aircraft to support the NATO activity in the Baltic, precisely in response to the cable cutting incident that we've seen there over Christmas. But at the moment, we spend about 2.3% of GDP on defence. And the commitment that we made at the general election is to move that to 2.5% of GDP. Now, that's a big, substantial increase. But as the Minister for the Armed Forces, I feel sometimes that the debate around just which percentage point we're spending on misses something in the fact that if we don't transform the structure, the shape, the capabilities we're fighting with, we can spend whatever percentage on, but it won't be the deterrent capabilities we need. And that's why we've got to get this right.
When John Healey says we will not shy away from robust action to protect this country, what does that actually mean? I mean, what kind of robust action? Like if a Russian ship like this does something similar again, do we sink it?
Well, what the Defence Secretary set out today, not just the declassification of what is a very serious operation that involved the Royal Navy, the Royal Fleet Auxiliary and the RAF. But publishing details of the activities of a nuclear submarine is very unusual. It is a strong message that we're sending. But in his statement, he made something which I don't think has been picked up in some of the media commentary. He changed the rules of engagement of our forces, which enabled them to be much closer to the Russian vessel than normally would be the case. Normally, in any type of confrontation like this, it's not like in the movies where they're like jamming up against each other. You would normally do it at a distance. By changing the rules of engagement, so the proximity between the Russian vessel, the spy ship, and our Navy assets was much, much closer. That is a very strong sign, a very strong signal to those forces that we are taking this much more seriously and that we will robustly defend our infrastructure.
Right, we do need to go to a break now. It's 21 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Watch live on Global Player. This is LBC.
We have in the studio Labour's Defence Minister Luke Pollard, Lucy Frazer, former Conservative Culture Secretary, Baroness Claire Fox, non-affiliated peer. Just explain what's the difference between non-affiliated and crossbench. I know I ask you this every time, but...
You have to apply to join the crossbench, or they have to ask you to join. And I think after a few
and you were
weeks,
blackballed.
It was pretty clear it wasn't going to work out. But there's actually quite a lot of us now who are non-affiliated.
OK, and Stephen Bush, future member of the House of Lords, I'm sure, but currently associate editor and columnist for the Financial Times. What does associate editor mean?
In practice, in my case, very little. It means that I occasionally help out on leaders and give advice on what our leader position should be on areas of expertise. Obviously, there are many other people on the editorial board who are more expert than me, so mostly I nod and smile and say I agree with what Robert Shrimsley just said.
Well, that's always wise, in my view. He's always a very valued panellist on this programme. In fact, we haven't had him on for a long time. We should get him on. Abdul in Ilford has our next question. Abdul, what would you like to ask?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Oh, pretty bad. Well, in fact, the line seems to be non-existent. Well, I've got the gist of what Abdul wants to ask here. Do we need to engage with our youth to prevent radicalisation rather than making it harder to purchase knives? Now, the Prime Minister has announced new measures making it harder to buy knives online, with 2 forms of ID required, along with a video recording to prove that the person using that ID actually owns it. Lucy Frazer, is that going to make a difference? Because I'm sure I remember similar initiatives in the past which don't seem to have been able to prevent people buying knives.
You're right, Ian. I don't think that's enough. I mean, what this absolutely terrible case shows, where three tragedies, is that things went wrong at multiple levels. Amazon didn't comply with its own guidelines in relation to the buying of knives, and I think there's an issue of age verification in relation to purchasing and posting online. And the institutions that already spotted this chap as a problem. He'd fallen out of school. He was referred to social services. He was referred to the Prevent programme 3 times, and they didn't take it forward. This shows tremendous failures in society. And what worries me, Ian, is that what Amazon have announced is an inquiry, and what the Prime Minister has announced is an inquiry into this issue. And that's not enough. As a former Prisons Minister, Minister for Youth Justice and Minister for Probation, terrible things happened on our watch. And you know immediately what the answers to these problems are. You don't need to do an inquiry in order to find out what the answers are. And so I think...
What are they?
Well, I'm sure that there are... Just doing one bit of legislation that you can announce and say is changing, as you've just mentioned, the Prime Minister has said isn't enough. What you need to have is people who are working in these sectors, who are well-resourced, who are following procedures, and you need to look very closely at all these things.
But if it was that simple, it would have all been solved under your government.
We did invest in Prevent, but obviously there were issues within it. And I think that what we need to know is immediately what is going to be done in each of those areas.
Claire Fox.
So I remember when Sir David Amess was brutally murdered, and for about 3 or 4 days afterwards, there was a debate about online safety, and I literally couldn't work out what the connection was at all. And to be honest, after the revelations here, the idea that my big concern should be online shopping on Amazon just feels like the most inappropriate reaction and response. And people are frustrated, and it feels like a distraction. Look over there, they're completely missing the point. So I don't think the issue is knives. That's the point I'm trying to make. That's not...
The issue is human beings.
Yeah, I mean, all I'm saying is, and people have said, but it's a bit cliched after today, but a lot of people have said you can find a knife in the kitchen, right? It's not, that's not, the point is, why did he want to use the knife and kill 3 little girls in a dance class, right? That's the problem. I do think that we have got major problems around Prevent, which is actually something that was known because the Shawcross Review said it, and a lot of us have known it, which is that the Prevent scheme have become completely waylaid. And one of the reasons why that is because it's been interpreted far too broadly, in my opinion, about what extremism is. So I know that during the Brexit years, for example, that teachers were reporting young people who were so pro-Brexit. I mean, I was actually on a panel where the head teacher seriously said we had a problem of extremism where all the students in a mock EU referendum voted to leave. And we've asked Prevent to look at it. And I couldn't believe... No, I know. I've written and spoken about this before. I genuinely couldn't believe it. And then other people started saying, no, so, if you look at the Prevent cases at Shawcross, I mean, that was my story. But there's a lot of examples. And I think that we've conflated a lot of things, a reluctance, for example, to name and shame radical Islamism. I mean, that has been a real problem with radicalisation and the rise of a particular brand of terrorism, and saying, well, it could be the far right, it could be this kind of extremism or that kind of extremism, doesn't help, because it also means that the Prevent teams are getting a range of complaints. I mean, there was actually a teacher, do you remember, it's not even remember, it only happened 2 years ago, a vicar, because he made a speech, a sermon on basically LGBT, and he was critical about the T aspect of it. He was reported to Prevent by his school and suspended. The case is still ongoing. So Prevent are therefore going to get all of these silly things thrown at them. So that's another problem. And I think in this instance, this young man was found with a knife 10 times. And nothing happened, right? I mean, that's the problem, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yes.
Stephen.
Well, the distinct problem in this case is, one, I agree with Claire that it doesn't seem to me that the problem here is what happens online. This is an example of someone being referred to Prevent 3 times. However, the reason why Prevent didn't really know what to do in this case is that this wasn't radical Islamism, and it wasn't, which makes up about 75% of the terror threat in this country is radical Islamism. It wasn't the radical right, which makes up most of the remaining 25%. It was a sort of new, almost non-ideological form of terrorism, sort of what looks to be what happened with the assassination of the United Healthcare CEO in the United States, where the suspect in that act of terror has quite confused and incoherent politics. So I actually think an inquiry is the appropriate way of dealing with that issue, because what you don't want is a situation in which prevent becomes this ever more vague, oh, our brief is to deal with hate, or, you know, some other kind of vague phrases, because actually the way that you tackle, spot, infiltrate, and ultimately degrade the capabilities of radical Islamism and the extremist far right is quite different from each other, right? Although they tend to have the same profile of people who get involved, i.e. alienated young men, and this, of course, is an alienated, violent young man whose main motivation just seems to have been violence of all kinds. But you do have to work out how it is your counter-terror operation deals with that new threat somehow. But yeah, my concern specifically is that often it feels that when we have some kind of tragedy, politicians reach for the familiar lever of, oh, this is about regulating the digital sphere in some ways, which it sometimes is about regulating the digital sphere, but it wasn't in the case of David Amess, and it isn't in this case, albeit for very different reasons.
Can I just pick up on that? Because Stephen's saying there should be an inquiry, and it may be the case that there should be an inquiry as part of a process. But the issue with an inquiry is what happens is the government said, there's an issue, and the government says, we'll do an inquiry. And then that's the end of that issue, and it goes away for a year because there's an inquiry. And actually this chap fell through the cracks in the system. He was chucked out of school, so why did no one look into that? You know, he was referred to social services. Was that not investigated? He was in touch with the police. So the system failed him, and
it
failed him and us. As in, he should have been picked up by the system, whatever. He was doing stuff that was wrong. And we need to look at those things, and we need to make sure that those kids are picked up. And we don't need an inquiry to find out what the answer should be for kids that are falling
Luke, as a member of the government, you're obviously going to support the fact there is going to be an inquiry. But there is an odd question here. Why hasn't there been an inquiry into the murder of Sir David Amess? Because, I mean, slightly similar circumstances in many ways. His family have persistently asked for an inquiry. Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister and James Cleverly as Home Secretary refused to meet Lady Amess and David's daughter. Yvette Cooper has also refused to meet them. And yet, within 24 hours of this man pleading guilty, suddenly an inquiry is announced here. Why is that?
Well, I don't know the circumstances of the refusal of the inquiry into Sir David Amess under the last government, but I find this area really hard, personally, actually, and that's because I might be on your show today as a government minister, but I'm also a constituency MP, and I represent the part of Plymouth where we had the mass shooting in Keam, and we didn't have an inquiry into what happened there. When I was watching the Prime Minister make his speech this week, it was about Stockport, and it is absolutely right that there's a line in the sand drawn about the horrendous failings of the state, repeated failings. But everything the Prime Minister said in his remarks spoke to me about the tragedy in Keam as well. The fact that the killer in Plymouth had been exploring content online. The fact that Prevent wouldn't have worked because, as Stephen's correctly said, that's about radical Islamic terror, and being an incel, having a violent hatred of women in the case in Plymouth, meant that it wouldn't have worked, but it should go somewhere else. And I think the concern that I really have a bit, and why actually, I do disagree with Lucy on this one, is there's been so many failings. And part of the reason we need to get to the root of this is because the failings are about a new type of terrorism, a new type of extremism that doesn't fit with our current systems. It's not someone trying to plant a car bomb. It's not radicalising large groups of people with a political philosophy. It's in many cases individuals in our communities, accessing radical information online that radicalises them, triggered by other life events, that is combined with failures of the state to do what they should do. And we had failings of the police in Plymouth, just as there's been failings of the law enforcement agencies in Stockport. And I think we should be getting to the bottom of some of those big failings. An inquiry is the right place for that to happen.
Right, we need to go to the news because we're running very, very late, and that's entirely my fault. It's 8:35. Let's go to the news headlines with Darryl Jackson.
Donald Trump's told Vladimir Putin to end what he calls a ridiculous war in Ukraine. The US president urged Russia's leader to make a peace deal or face a series of taxes, tariffs and sanctions. Campaigners are calling Prince Harry's settlement with news group newspapers a humiliating day for the Sun. Following a lengthy High Court battle, the Duke of Sussex has been given an apology and damages. And the head teacher of a 12-year-old boy who was stabbed to death in Birmingham has described him as bright and adored. A 14-year-old boy is being questioned over the death of Leo Ross in Hall Green yesterday. LBC weather, showers on coasts tonight, dry elsewhere and a low of 1 degree.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
8:38, a question from Anthony in Westminster to our panel. We've got Luke Pollard, Labour's Defence Minister, Lucy Frazer, former Conservative Culture Secretary, Baroness Claire Fox and Stephen Bush from the Financial Times. Right, Anthony wants to ask, what effect will the settlement of Prince Harry's case against the Sun's publisher have on the British public's view of Prince Harry? And do you think some rehabilitation or reconciliation with the rest of his family is now more likely? Let me add a supplementary into that, because I suspect the more important question is, will it have an effect on an effect on the way the media operate, rather than necessarily on Prince Harry's reputation? Stephen?
I think, to be honest, I think the media has changed a great deal since the period in question. That Prince Harry rightly wanted to get, I was about to say his day in court, but to get the statement and the disclosure that he's successfully secured today. I think the media is a very different beast in this country than it was. I think rightly, readers expect a higher standard and a higher standard of ethics from us than parts of our industry displayed back then over phone hacking. I think the positive thing is that this is the first time that the Sun newspaper has acknowledged that it wasn't just a thing that happened at News of the World. But I think it ultimately, Prince Harry has successfully secured a really important disclosure about what happened.
Claire?
I think that for Prince Harry, the idea that he can rehabilitate himself around this is for the birds. I think the idea that his privacy was invaded when he's revealed so much about his family, about himself, and, you know, it's become a kind of joke that he says, nobody should intrude in my, you know, and have the signs up saying, look at me, you know, it's kind of a Southport meme or whatever, right? So I don't think that's of any interest. He's perfectly entitled and right to be pleased that he's got the statement. But I just don't think everyone's going to go, we always thought that he was, you know. What I'm worried about, though, is I'm worried about any potential for having a chilling effect or a gagging effect on tabloid journalism, because I actually want them to be lively, inquisitive, and not intimidated. That's not to in any way justify, of course, phone hacking. I understand that, but it's just that we are living in censorious times where I feel that sometimes the media are too orthodox, don't ask the right questions, don't burrow around, and we have lost some good things from those old days, which is the kind of investigative hack, asking all the awkward questions.
Have we really?
I don't think there's...
If you look at what goes on the internet, there's a lot more investigation that goes on nowadays.
Well, I was going to say, but I'm saying newspapers, right? And because what I was then going to say was, because what then happens is you get a slightly tame, as it were, mainstream media, and then the only place where you get all of that burrowing away going on is more online. And I would actually, I still quite like the idea that the media, you know, the way that people, what do they call it, the legacy media. I don't want the legacy media to give up and become tame just because there's a very lively online presence of people investigating things. I want both of those things to be true.
I simply just don't think it's true to say that any of the award-winning scoops that my colleagues in our investigative team are tame, or indeed any of our commercial rivals. I would defy anyone to look at, say, the Times' scoops and go, that is a tame newspaper.
No, but there's not enough scoops, there's not enough investigative journalism. I mean, most journalists in mainstream media that I know complain that not enough investment is going into investigative journalism.
We'd always like more money spent
No, but
spent
not
on
just money, but money,
about that
time.
in 1990.
No, I know, but I'm saying it's got less and less, and I think that I'm
But we also shouldn't
that there's an
pretend
orthodoxy.
that hacking a member of the royal family's phone is useful investigative journalism, right?
I didn't suggest that. Don't suggest that. I'm suggesting that I don't think that the mainstream media are querulous enough and investigative enough and awkward squad enough. And I made the point that this is not about defending phone hacking. I'm just saying that whether today's settlement will add to that sense that the lawyers will get you in the end, and the legal departments of most newspapers and, in fact, radio stations and all the rest of it, people will tell me, stop awkward questions being asked.
Lucy Frazer.
I agree with both Stephen and Claire that the media plays an absolutely fundamental role in society, and you know, with freedom comes responsibility, and there was wrongdoing, so it's right that there's been a victory in this case. But I think it's important to remember that we have a free press in this country, and there are some countries that don't. And I think it's important to remember that there are journalists who are risking their lives every day in order to give us that free, that news about freedom.
But if you look at the league table on Index on Press Freedom, we come fairly low down, don't we?
We don't come as high as we should. You're absolutely right. And we need to do more about that. But there are many countries in which you cannot say what you want, and the government controls the media, and that's absolutely not the case here. And we have examples, terrible examples, of where, you know, where journalists have lost their lives. Many journalists have lost their lives in Gaza and Israel. In the recent war, James Foley was killed by ISIS, beheaded for doing his job. You know, Van Gershkovitz, you know, locked up in prison in Russia. So I think we need to defend the media, particularly the traditional media that Claire was talking about, because they do play a fundamental role in our democracy.
Luke.
It's not just Prince Harry today, though, of course. It was also Tom Watson, the former deputy leader of the Labour Party, who got a substantial apology from newspapers. And I think it's not only a really important chapter closing for those individuals, Prince Harry and for Tom Watson. I think it needs to be an era where we start recognising that real intrusions into people's lives were carried out, not necessarily by journalists, but by private investigators hired by those newspapers to deliberately invade people's privacy, to try and find stories on them at all costs. That's not right. And I agree with Lucy, we should be promoting press freedoms. We should be looking for a robust public debate about issues, especially for those people in the public eye. They should be expected to face difficult questions. But I think how you find those stories, how you challenge people, I think there are certain rules of behaviour that should be there. I don't think they should always need to be legislative, but there's just decency. And I think one thing that we're seeing across much of our public life is that we've kind of lost a bit of decency. We've lost a bit of respect. We've lost how to be decent to one another. And I think the era of when the phone hacking and these private investigators, it might be, in political terms, 1 million years ago, but it was only 10, 15 years ago in terms of reality. We've got to be getting better. But if we are to defend those press freedoms, which I think are absolutely vital to defend, especially when there are nations that are persecuting journalists, we've got to also demand decency from those people writing out the stories as well.
You've actually just sparked off a memory from me, a rather unfortunate one. You and I used to be bloggers, and that's how I first came across you. And around 2009, 2010, I remember being asked to write an article for the Mail on Sunday, particularly about Tom Watson. And I wrote this article, and he phoned me up the next day, said, "Look, I'm not going to make a big thing of this, but you have actually libelled me." And then he explained what I'd got wrong. And he dealt with it in such a responsible way where he could have sued me or the Mail on Sunday at least for quite a lot of money, I suspect. But he didn't. And so when I saw this result today, I thought, well, there must have been something really, really bad here for you to have gone to these lengths and risked, presumably, going bankrupt as a result of it if costs had been awarded against you. So thanks for reminding me of that rather horrific experience where it's one of those phone calls, and I don't know if you've ever had this, Stephen, as a journalist. You have a phone call from someone and your stomach feels rather empty.
Yeah, the worst thing is when you realise you have got the story wrong. Yeah. And it is one of those things which always lives with you and then recurs in the pit of a bad night.
But can I just I do want to say that it would be wrong to not note that things like we have different problems now. You can have cancel culture where people can trawl through your social media and try and destroy you through some tweet that you used. And so phone hacking might have gone, but there's a lot else going on. And by the way, a lot of journalists treat that as though that's investigative journalism. It drives me mad. You can have a situation whereby people just denounce things as misinformation or bigotry or this phobia or that phobia to chill discussion. And I think that's having an impact on the media, on and offline, and it's not healthy because for all the reasons that Lucy said, we need to have open, free debate, and sometimes that can be uncomfortable, but it's worth it.
OK, we are looking forward to our fun question at the end of the programme. Don't know what it is yet, but it's 8:48.
This is LBC. People Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:51 on LBC. We have with us Luke Pollard, Labour's Defence Minister, Lucy Frazer, former Conservative Culture Secretary, Baroness Claire Fox, non-aligned peer, and Stephen Bush from the Financial Times. Olivia in Cambridge says, is Rachel Reeves right to say one of the key reasons for our poor economic growth is NIMBYs saying no to everything? Now, this morning, the Chancellor was asked about the rumours of the government approving the expansion of Heathrow, Gatwick and Luton airports during a Q&A in Davos. While she wouldn't say where she stands on that issue directly, she did say the following. This is a direct quote. When the last government faced difficult decisions about whether to support infrastructure investment, the answer always seemed to be no. We can't carry on like that because if we do, we will miss out on crucial investment here in Britain. I mean, it seems to be that there will be an announcement on a new runway in Heathrow fairly soon. Stephen Bush, what are you hearing?
Well, so the Chancellor has always been a supporter of it and is minded to do so. Of course, it's much less far along than any of the other airport projects because of the political uncertainty. It is, of course, bitterly opposed by others in the government, including her own Chief Secretary, and most importantly, of course, Ed Miliband, the Secretary of State for Net Zero. But as a signal that the UK is building things, it is a shovel-ready project, but it is also free from the perspective of the national government. It's a thing which all the government has to do is approve. They don't have to put their own hands in their pockets. So you would assume it would be something that we'll get progress on fairly swiftly.
Of course, the Prime Minister tweeted in February 2020, congratulations to the climate campaigners. There is no more important challenge than the climate emergency. That is why I voted against Heathrow expansion. Luke Pollard, the Prime Minister has made plenty of U-turns since he stood for the leadership of the Labour Party. Is this going to be another one?
I mean, I genuinely don't know what may or may not happen in relation to this, and I think it's not right for me as Minister to concentrate on hypotheticals. But if you relate it to your basic question, we've got to get building again as a country. I get so frustrated that in my part of the world in the southwest, we have a housing crisis. We need to build more homes. We need to build better railways. We need to make sure that the big infrastructure projects are not caught up in years of delays, are not so expensive because we've built £100 million back tunnel. So it means that you can't possibly build any infrastructure.
And it's not even where the bats cross, apparently. Oh, the one you're talking about.
We've got to get building again. I think if you speak to folks, who aren't familiar with the planning system or the politics of it, they just get a frustration that they see other countries building stuff, other countries having high-speed rail networks that connect every major city. And we struggle sometimes to get a train across the Pennines or get a train from Exeter to Plymouth that doesn't get washed away by the waves. This is the type of projects I think that we need to start getting building. I'm really pleased, actually, that, one of the manifesto commitments we had is 1.5 million homes. It's really hard to deliver, but we need to build more homes. And actually, we should be putting stretching and challenging targets in for that. But building stuff will always annoy somebody. And I hope that we can listen to the YIMBYs, the people that want building in their backyard, just as much as some.
But isn't there an innate conflict here? Because one of the things that the government has made clear is that they want to achieve net zero. Ed Miliband is the sort of flag waver for that. He voted, he threatened to resign, I understand, at the end of Gordon Brown's government over an expansion at Heathrow. This puts him in a terribly difficult position. And it just doesn't sort of meet with all of the other policies on net zero, does it? That's the problem. It's difficult to explain.
Well, I'm not certain whether this is yet a policy, but it's certainly a debate. Net zero is about netting your emissions off against things that capture carbon and sequester it. And so we can still do things in aviation that reduces the environmental impact. More sustainable fuels is something that the government is working on at the moment. Indeed, the last government worked on their Jet Zero initiatives to try and get there. It needs to be long-term so we can start taking down the environmental impact, demanding that any plane that uses UK airports is the most modern, so gets rid of some of the really old, noisy, polluting aircraft that we've had. These are the type of initiatives that are being taken forward by government, indeed probably were the last government, but we need to do more as well.
Yeah.
Why it's frustrating is because I have argued for a third runway at Heathrow for many a year because I'm old. And the last time I did it, actually, I was in Parliament, I got absolutely savaged by Labour and the Tories both of you, right, who gave me lectures in a hectoring way about the importance of the climate emergency, and I was being irresponsible. So that's just to note. So I don't want to blame NIMBYs, because that's one of the things that's a bit unfortunate. I don't think politicians go around pointing at the public and say, you selfish people. The regulatory hell that has led to this is an obsessive attempt at using regulation around decarbonisation and net zero to stop growth, in my opinion, but not just in my opinion, that's what's happened, which is now. So, I mean, it's great to hear Luke kind of, ridiculing those people who talk about newts and bats and so on, because all I'm saying is when one has done that over the years, you're treated as though you're kind of cruel to animals who've got no responsibility.
Don't leave your Twitter feed tonight, Luke.
Every single barrier that could possibly happen to growth has been thrown up. Now, I'm delighted if she does this, but then, even though I want it, and I'm not just trying to be churlish, it's a bit like, this is a bit out of nowhere, right? Because actually growth strategy isn't going to be created by the third runway. I'm glad that jobs will be created, that's fine, it's symbolic. But what we really need is to re-look at the whole growth strategy. And the chemical industry, the steel industry, all of these are held back, in my opinion, by eco-regulatory overzealousness.
Claire, thank you. Lucy?
Well, I would say three things. The first is it's a bit rich for Rachel Reeves to say that one of the key reasons for our poor economic growth is NIMBYs. One of the key reasons why we haven't got economic growth in the country at the moment is that she's increased taxes.
Okay, well, let's leave that to one side, because we've only got literally 90 seconds to go before our fun question.
Second reason is tourism contributes massively to our GDP. It's about 10% of GDP. So there is a good economic reason to build on Heathrow. And I think...
But you were part of a government that didn't want to.
And I'm now no longer part of that government, and I think we should have growth and investment.
So this is the advantage, Luke, when you're out of government, you can speak your mind.
And the third point is Luke is going to be in a difficult position because, of course, we need to build homes, but he will know as a constituency MP that people want building across the country, but they don't always want it near their own home. And so I think Labour are going to have got a very political issue coming down the tracks.
They do want homes for their kids and grandkids.
For local MPs.
Right. Let's move on. Ross in Winchester wants to know the answer to this very important question. Trump's redesigns of the Oval Office have been revealed, with him having changed which former presidents there are portraits of on the walls, brought the sculpture of Churchill back, and restored his red button for ordering Diet Cokes. If you could have a button like that to have only one thing brought straight to you whenever you wanted, what would it be for? Stephen Bush.
It would actually be my glasses. So I do all of the cooking at home, and I will always, I'll take them off to take something out of the thing. I'll put them on top of somewhere. Then I'll have to find my spare pair. Then I'll be like, wait, where's the other pair gone? And if I could just have a button, which is embarrassing given it's a very small flat, right? But if I could just have a button and I would press it and someone would go, here are your glasses, I think that would add a good hour to my day that is currently spent looking for my glasses.
Claire Fox, you get traduced on social media, not least when I announced that you were coming on this programme. But I've got to read out this text from, I can't actually read it, Clement, who says, fab panel tonight, Iain, all are great, but I'm on bended knee listening to Claire Fox.
I couldn't decide if it was an insult or not. Yes.
So your red button.
I have relatively recently given up smoking.
No.
I have become an obsessive vaper. So I'm afraid that and if the government do something to stop my vaping, I will have a hernia, so don't do that. That's a threat on air, right? But anyway, I need a permanent supply of disposable vapes, and I would love that.
Okay, Lucy?
Well, first of all, I'm really pleased that the President's brought back the sculpture of Churchill. That's great news. I'd like a button, well, any button giving me anything would be fab, but if I could have a button that gave me an extra hour on top of the day that nobody else had, I'd really love that.
That's a bit of an ask, but an innovative answer, I'll give you that. Luke?
I'm afraid I'm a big fan of cake. And so, if I've got the ability to get a button that brings me anything I want, I'm afraid it's going to be some Victoria sponge arriving every time I press it.
By the way, Stephen, I have to say, I completely empathised on the glasses question.
I'm glad they're not.
Yeah, but you'd also
Well, you used to have something around your neck, didn't you? A Dame Edna thing.
I did, for a very brief period, try wearing them around my neck, but I really did think I'm old enough without looking like an
do
extra
when you need it
20
also
years
for
old.
your keys and for your phone.
Yeah, but the glasses are a particular
it's
thing in
such
my
a pain.
life.
Your
I
mention of
can't
cake
see,
reminds
so.
me, Luke, that I said to our political correspondent, Aggie Shornbury, once live on air, well, you look like a person who likes a bit of cake. And she said afterwards, you were saying that I was fat. I was saying nothing of the sort, but she's never forgotten it. Right, thank you all very much indeed for coming on the show tonight. Monday's panel includes the Conservative MP and Vice President of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, Sir Alex Shelbrooke, a fellow West Ham supporter, the social commentator Nels Abbey, and LBC's very own political editor Natasha Clark. Coming up in the next hour, we're going to talk about a very serious subject. We're going to talk about eating disorders, because lives are being lost and families torn apart because of what are called woefully inadequate care for people with eating disorders. This is according to a group of MPs who've issued a report today. The alarming rise in disorders such as anorexia and bulimia over the past decade has now become an emergency, according to the all-party parliamentary group on eating disorders. So if you've got experience of eating disorders, either you personally or your friends or your family, we'd love to hear from you. But what can be done to improve the treatment for people who suffer from eating disorders? 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, Donald Trump's threatened Russia with further sanctions unless it ends what he's called the ridiculous war in Ukraine. The new US president urged Vladimir Putin to make a deal. But a Russian envoy at the UN says Moscow will have to see what a